Здравствуйте. Welcome to my presentation on Rachmaninov and Russian vocal music. So I wanted to start off my presentation with the singing portion because I'm freshly warmed up, and also because this repertoire may not be as well known or familiar to you as some of the others in this class. And so I wanted to immerse you in this Russian sound world. So I chose Полюбила я напича свою by Sergei Rachmaninov. And in English, the title would be The Soldier's Wife, and in French, L'épouse du soldat. And the text is by Ukrainian poet Taras Spichenka, and the text was translated into Russian by Pleschev, which Rachmaninov set. So the story is a very typically Russian bleak story, beautifully sorrowful, and it talks about a woman who falls in love to her great distress with this orphan boy who is then taken by powerful people to become a military recruit, and so she is left to grow old and alone in a stranger's house. So it's a really poignant piece, short but really packs a punch. And so here's a score for you to follow along, and I'll be accompanying myself because, as you may know, I spent more years of my life as a pianist. I was a pianist since the age of 6, and I've only been a singer for about 6-7 years. So it's an enormous pleasure to present this music, having grown up playing a lot of Rachmaninoff as a teenager. And so here is The Soldier's Wife. And I should mention as well, there is a blank score in the Dropbox if you prefer that, and also if you wanted to have a larger copy to follow along with as well. Знав чужой избы и состареюсь. Уж такая доля мне выпала. So a couple interesting things about this selection. The accents, when I worked with the Russian coach, don't really indicate that you should hammer out each note because they're often written one after the other in the vocal line, but rather to emphasize or to have a little bit more rubato, certain words and text, so it's more expressive. And I've chosen a recording by Jenny Turrell, an American soprano, mezzo-soprano rather, who was born in the Russian Federation. And this recording is a little bit of an older one, in her career, earlier in her career. So it shows a little bit more of an older school style of diction, which is more appropriate maybe to the Moscow school, Muscovite school. And so she opens up certain vowels such as silnaya to silnaya, and also this recording is relatively fast and it's relatively restrained in terms of the use of vibrato, and it shows a little bit of maybe of a different perspective of this recording as well, of this piece as well. So here is Jenny Terrell's recording. And so I've also chosen some other recordings as well, which I put on the previous slide. And there's actually an older recording, a recording done later in her career when she was older, of Jenny Terrell singing the same piece. And there's more rubato, she closes the vowels, so it's a little bit more contemporary sounding diction-wise. And there's a little bit more rubato. And the recording by Slobodskaya is also really interesting. She has a moment where she really emphasizes I soldatkaya, which I really did in my recording, in my version as well, which really emphasizes growing old, I think. And as well, there's a recording by Söderström, which she's not a native Russian speaker, and there are a few vowel errors, such as turning some of the unaccented O's into pure O's. So it's really interesting to listen to this repertoire, especially sung by native Russian speakers who really have such a way of coloring the text and such precision with it. And so obviously it's out of the scope of my presentation, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Russian classical vocal music, because it's really not that well known compared to a lot of the other genres, which we sing a lot more. And so there's a lot of sort of peasant work songs and the Eastern European chants of the church and a large folk heritage, but really no strong music scene before Tsar Peter the Great really put Russia on the map and helped to bring it into the modern world and an enlightened world power with lots of connections with the Western European world. And so eventually there started to be lots of composers that worked in Russia, especially Italian composers, even up until Verdi, whose Forza del Destino is actually premiered in St. Petersburg, you may not know. And eventually the operas began to be written in Russian as well, also in German and Italian, but eventually Russian opera started to happen as well. There's a really interesting recording by Cecilia Bartli, who records this Russian Baroque repertoire, which is so unknown, and it's housed in the Mariinsky Theater. But however, when Glinka's Life for the Tsar premiered in 1836, this was really considered the birth of Russian opera. And of course, the Russian Romantics are really probably what people know the most of in terms of Russian classical music, and for good reason. So one of their big innovations was the Russian Romance, which comes from the French, and there are two schools of this music, but what's in common is that it's music written for piano and voice, and so one group is the more 19th century European Romantic style salon romance, which is exemplified from Glinka to Tchaikovsky to Rimsky-Korsakov to Rachmaninov's romances. And the second branch might be considered a little bit more modern, the newer Russian musical school, which captured more of the peasant realism and speech-like, recit-like human speech patterns. And this was more exemplified by the Romuzhsky, the Mighty Five, or the Moguchi Yakushka, and Shostakovich. And there's even a recording that I've included of Frank Sinatra singing None by the Lonely Heart, actually in English though, but probably the most famous romance by Tchaikovsky. And it's quite interesting to see how the vocal styles and conventions continue to develop from this repertoire. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Rachmaninov, the composer. And so being a pianist, I wanted to also include for you an excerpt of his piano music. So I've chosen the end of his Élégie from his Morceau de Fantaisie, which was his Opus 3, so very early in his career. So clearly, the piano was a huge part of his career, if you didn't know already. And he was famous for his very wide handspan, which is parodied in this video. And what's interesting as well is that he was close enough to our time where we have many recordings of his music. And you can listen to his recording of his Élégie here. And it's interesting because even though his scores are very heavily notated, he didn't always follow his own intentions in the music, and sometimes he even changed notes or added things. And so it's interesting because this music has a lot of notations, like many late romantic composers who wanted to specify things, but as well there was clearly a lot of individual personal freedom of expression that he allowed the interpreter. And so besides his enormous piano output, including the incredible piano concerti, which are world famous for being exceptionally difficult, he also wrote vocal music, and in terms of opera, El Eco is probably the most famous and the biggest one, but there's also other stage works such as Miser Night and Francesca. And he also worked as a conductor and as a concert pianist who was famous in Europe and Russia, of course, but Europe and the States after he left Russia, and dazzled the world with his incredible technique and musicality. In terms of his vocal music, he wrote 70 romances in 7 sets, so it's a lot of repertoire. And there are artists who have recorded the whole output of his vocal music, which is quite a challenge because he wrote this music for very specific singers in mind and specific voice types. So if one singer was to record all of it, they would have to transpose some of the songs to suit their voice. And so the music obviously is very similar to his other output, including his very famous piano music. It's very hard on the sleeve, emotional, demonstrative, and a spacious lyricism that's really continued from the compositions of Tchaikovsky. And like Liszt or Schumann, who were pianists that also composed vocal music, it's conceived in a similar idea. They're very pianistic and collaborative accompaniments, and interwoven with the vocal line, often brilliant and very rich harmonically, with extensive intros, interludes, postludes, and also Rachmaninoff tends to have a lot of cross rhythms with the voice. The subjects are often about nature and religious images, and for the voice, it's a wide range of notes and dynamics, very operatic in style, favoring dark, rich, and middle voices, though not exclusively, and a full vibrato and portamento. Often there are laments on the A vowel, such as the one I had in this piece, and there's of course this very famous vocalese, which has no words at all, so the expression is not limited just to text, and there's a lot of passion, drama, and power. However, later in his career, there was more recit-like and speech-like music, less operatic, and the poetry of Russian symbolist poems, so a little bit more similar to Mussorgsky. And he never wrote another romance after leaving Russia at age 45 in 1918, so this repertoire clearly was very personal for him, and he had many years of compositional silence where he couldn't compose after leaving Russia. And I won't talk too much about Schleipin, but he was a Russian bass. Many recordings exist of him as well. And he was an inspiration for both the Stanislavski School of Acting as well as Rachmaninov, and he composed many pieces specifically for him. And he smoked as well, which is super interesting as a singer. So crash course in Russian diction, all of Russian diction in 2 minutes. No, not likely. It's a very complex language, but it's a really beautiful repertoire, and it's a shame that it's sort of being looked at with intimidation because of the difficulty of the language, as well there's been anti-Soviet, anti-communist sentiments in the Western world for many years. But this repertoire is really coming to the forefront now, and they're transliterations, but they're tricky because it's different depending on the language. However, so it's good to really know the Cyrillic alphabet in Russian when learning this repertoire. I taught myself how to read it on Duolingo, so there's a lot of resources online. And what's tricky is they're both hard and soft consonants, or unpalatalized and palatalized consonants. There's the famous Slavic dark ale, and even though there's a stereotype of dark language, they're both bright and dark vowels in Russian. And the O vowels, it's tricky because depending on the word stress, they're either pure O or de-emphasized. And so word stress is super important in Russian music and in the Russian language. And also in terms of grammar and syntax, it's quite different. There are no articles such as the or a in the language, and there are a lot of single letter words such as and v, which are multi-purpose prepositions, and they often create lots of consonant clusters, 3 or 4 consonants in a row, which might be new to a lot of people. And in terms of the Cyrillic alphabet, there's lots of characters that are similar to ours, and some are pronounced similarly to what we know, and some are characters we use that are pronounced differently. And there are also characters borrowed from the Greek alphabet, and some that are new to us. The Ö is particularly a very tricky one, a darker backward E vowel. And so there are lots of tricky new sounds, and there are also hard and soft symbols, not all of which are used regularly today, but you will find this in the repertoire of Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninov pre the Revolution, so pre-1917. And there are also some tricky details, the icing on the blini, let's say. So there's the J glide is tricky to master. It's actually more of a fricative consonant. And also there's different schools of thoughts about pronunciation, as I mentioned earlier. The Muscovite pronunciation versus the St. Petersburg pronunciation. Should you open vowels or not? And so here's a little bit of a crash course. Of course, it's super important to see coaches. We have Anna Paletsis and Tatiana Dardikina, who I've worked with at McGill, who are fantastic. And I've also worked with coaches in Ontario, and there are many available online. And so many resources, including the Schirmer scores, have some Russian arias and IPA and recordings. The Belov series is super popular and well known. My personal favorite for Rachmaninoff's music is Untitled Chapter, who has a complete poetic, literal translations of all of his 71 songs and romances, and also the IPA. And also my bibliography has more resources as well. And a big concept in Russian music is the concept of toska. So I have a little quote from Elena Gorokova's memoir, Russian Tattoo. Toska is a combination of melancholy and longing, I say. It's a deep sadness and the awareness that something has been lost. It's what you find in every Russian book published before 1917, but there are also other ingredients in toska for which I don't have words, things submerged deeply under layers of silt on the soft bottom of the Russian soul. And so I'll be singing some more romances of Rachmaninov, including The Soldier's Wife, along with a gender-bending version of Schumann's Frauenleben und Leben and Poulenc's Bestiaire. In the fall, it was supposed to be around Mother's Day weekend in May, but it's been rescheduled to the fall for obvious reasons. So I hope to see you there. Otherwise, thank you so much. And future Mike's happy to take any questions you have. Спасибо и до свидания.